Welcome to episode 217 of Silver Lining for Learning. You're here with us now in the year 2025. And man is still alive. Through almost 5 years of Silver Lining for Learning. We have an anniversary show coming up in March, mid-March. But for now, we're still in season 5. And we're going to reflect on the past year's episodes, or at least the past couple of months, and reflect on where we're going a bit in this show. Last night, maybe yesterday afternoon, I sent a message to the 3 co-hosts with us today, Lydia Cao from the University of Toronto, Chris Dede from Harvard, and Punya Mishra from Arizona State. They all responded in quick fashion with questions for us, issues for us, announcements that we'll talk about today in this great episode. I think we should start with Lydia's questions since she jumped in and she is our newest co-host. So let's get her thoughts on what she's thought we've done in the past year and where we should be going. Lydia, would you like to share with us a bit of your reflections as well as the questions that you had for us that I'm sure all of us spent the night dreaming about answering? Lydia.
Thank you, Kurt. It's quite humbling to ask me to start to reflect for the past year. So I've been actually dreaming about like what I'm gonna say today. And so one thing I start to reflect upon, actually I listened to the reflection episode for last year at New Year's time. I was wondering what people were saying last year at this time. And that reminded me to think about that it seems education has always, to an extent, reacting to new technologies being developed. And then a new thing came up, like social media came up, generative AI came up, and then we're always kind of in a position to say what we're going to do with it, kind of in a reaction position. So I'm wondering, in the next year forward and in the future, how can education be more of a proactive position to design these technology for the kind of learning we would like to see in the classroom and to support the human flourishment we would like to see. So that's my brief reflection. And for the questions, I was wondering, so this is a question for all of you. Having been like one of the first listeners of Silver Lining for Learning, I'm just wondering, how has the role of technology in education evolved since you started this show? And the second question is, as we start this new year, what gave you most hope for the future? And what do you see as the silver linings?
You know, one way that technology has changed during the last 5 years, our definitions of what the delivery of education has changed. For instance, blended learning, which I have a handbook of blended learning back in 2006. We have 39 chapters of 39 different definitions in it and models of it. But, you know, I was at a faculty meeting a couple of weeks back, and every faculty member had a different aspect of blended learning coming out of their mouths when they talk about blended learning because of being forced to move into the Zoom space during COVID. And so while faculty are definitely understanding of the possibilities of blended learning, there is no one real definition or understanding of what we're all meaning, especially when instructors talk to administrators. They each have different notions of what it means to blend. Administrators talk about maybe having a blended experience on campus for a semester or a couple of weeks. But faculty now are in this space where we're constantly moving between asynchronous and synchronous. And so for many, it is the combining of the sync and asynchronous together is the blended learning. For others, it's still having offloaded some components from their course to a web space of some kind, whether it's the exams or the discussion format, discussion groups, or something else. And so for me, I see us the changes are happening right in front of our eyes in terms of how we understand our roles as instructors, how we actually are volunteering to teach a section of a class. We don't even know the format we're going to teach in when we're volunteering to do so, because technologies are changing so fast. So we might be volunteering for something that's really, really, really difficult because the ways in which we blend today are complex and often don't work, because the systems that were set up pre-COVID are different than the way we're delivering instruction now. And as we transition to a post-COVID era, the expectations are going to be that we can do all of that the way we were teaching previously 10 years ago, 20 years ago, as well as the way we were doing during COVID, as well as the new ways that emerge as we go this year and beyond into 2025. So for me, it's the integration of technology in the delivery of instruction has changed. And also the student expectations of it have changed as well. We have moved from being a primarily Research One residential campus to being a online learning campus, at least 20%, but the School of Education, I would say it's, in my mind, it's probably over 50%. In my department, it's probably 80 to 90% of our students are coming remotely. And those students have different needs and different expectations of familiarization with technologies that we have in our instruction. And so it's become difficult there as well because of their full-time work status and family roles and responsibilities. They're not the typical residential students that we have that we can immediately acclimate to the technologies that we have. And so it's become a little more difficult, I think, as for me as an instructor, and I'm sure for others around the country and around the world, to fully embrace all the technologies that are in front of us as instructors to effectively individualize and personalize the learning where possible and not overwhelm the students because they're not on campus and we can't handhold them a bit and provide them with that type of training. So I'm sorry, I went off on a totally different tangent than what you were probably expecting. But for me, the area that I see the biggest change is the online learning space, in particular blended learning space, because it's gotten really, really difficult and complex as an instructor to be effective, to be personalized, as I said, in our instruction with our students, and to survive, to be honest. It's tiring, all the integration of technologies that we have without having released or given up anything that we were previously doing. I'll end there.
Chris, I might take us in a slightly different direction, so why don't you jump in first?
So I confess that there has been something about which I have been wrong for the entire half century of my career, repeatedly wrong. I went into education because I felt it was done really badly, and I felt I had suffered as a student because of that, and I saw an opportunity to make a difference. And I've kept saying to myself over 5 decades, surely this will be the thing that finally changes the industrial education model. Surely the microcomputer, surely online learning, surely social media, surely artificial intelligence, surely immersive media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm a slow learner, I guess, because none of those things have accomplished a major transformation in the educational model. And in fact, there's a bigger gap now between how the rest of society handles operations and how education handles its operations than there was when I started my career. Because the rest of society has been far more responsive to transforming based on what's happening with these new technologies. So I'm sure that I felt in March 2020 that this was it. This was finally going to be the thing that forced education to transform. And, here we are talking about the fact, and I agree, Kurt, that it's a mess. But it's a mess because what we're trying to do is to retrofit, we're retrofitting technology onto the horse-drawn carriage as opposed to inventing the car. And it's going to continue to be a mess for as long as we do that. And I can't say I'm optimistic anymore. I'm resilient. I'm tenacious. I ain't quitting, but I'm not optimistic anymore about whether or not this transformation is going to happen in my lifetime. So that's my perspective at the start of 2025.
All right. So, Lydia, I loved your questions. I want to take them sort of in sequence, but also digress a little bit, if that's okay. So, and Chris, you'll see where I end up is I share that pessimism, but I also have a silver lining, and I think it's got to do with our show in some interesting way. So what the thing around like Ed sort of always sort of trying to play catch up with technology, in some ways, I think I've come to think that maybe is the wrong question to ask in some ways, and in our email exchange, I mentioned the fact that we lost Lee Schulman on the 30th of December of 2024. And I did want to take a moment to sort of honor this amazing scholar and researcher. And on my website, I have a little sort of recognition of what he meant to me personally, written there, which I'll link to in the webpage, in the post. But I think what Lee Schulman captured is in his work and life is sort of how deeply human this enterprise of teaching and learning is, right? And it's not that he didn't work with large systems, whether it's the Carnegie, higher education thing, or whether it's in his research and scholarship. I think he did that, but at the same time, he always sort of recognized that the real thing is happening in particular specific context, in particular specific classroom context with the interaction between students and teacher. And so I think so that's why, Chris, I think this is where I think I never came into this saying that technology is going to transform it, because I think technology, Kurt, are you screen sharing? Thank you. Because I thought that it's going to happen in pockets, it's going to happen in interesting spaces, and whether we are asking the right questions. So I think a lot of the questions that are being asked about AI and education, I think are misguided. I think Chris has spoken very eloquently and written about it in terms of like augmenting intelligence as opposed to, artificial intelligence and all of those kinds of things, right? So I think going back to some of the deeper principles and ideas that people like Lee Schulman stood for, that their work stands for, about a deeply humanistic education, and then seeing where technology can play a role in that, I think is a really powerful thing. I think that's how we should be thinking about it. And the question that really made me think was that how has technology changed in this 5 years? And I realized that it's not the technology that has changed as much as that I have changed. I think I have sort of traversed that path that sort of Chris talked about in a slightly different way, but increasingly become sensitive to whether or not technology changes what happens in the classroom. These technologies change the world within which classroom happens. And I think a lot of the edtech research has focused on, if we gave people AR, VR, do girls respond better than boys if we have a feminine versus a male avatar, right? I mean, and that's an actual study. I'm not making that up. I mean, those are actual studies that we have done. Or whether including a hypertext is going to change the way people, what we didn't realize is the advent of the internet, the advent of social media, and now AI is transforming the world within which the classroom exists. And classrooms now have to sort of figure out, because the students coming in, the teachers in that spaces, they have changed in the way they engage and interact with each other. So that's one realization. The second realization that I sort of over the past 5 or 6 years, and again, it's not brand new, but it's something that had been in the back of my mind, but has been foregrounded quite significantly, is that there are broader social, economic, political pressures that determine a lot of the things that we do that we really as educators have no control over. So, Kurt, taking the example that you gave of like hybrid and online learning, those are usually instantiated within large, learning management systems. Those learning management systems are at heart not teaching and learning systems, they are management systems. So they are by design about how the IT personnel in the back end can ensure that they don't get hacked, so the structures are designed for management, not for education. Education, we manage to try to fit it within that somehow, right? We do our best, and I know Kurt is a very dedicated educator, and he cares deeply about that connection with students, but the system is actually in the way. The system is about collecting data. The system is about protecting this and doing that. Some good, some bad, don't get me wrong. Not all of it is bad, right? But it is not inherently designed to enhance the student learning experience, right? It is to manage it. And I think that those large and take AI, for example. This is a technology that is not ready for prime time, but it is now everywhere in the world. I don't know if you saw my blog post. This was the funniest blog post I've written in a long time, where I gave things that look like optical illusions, but were not optical illusions. So, the two lines which are this way, and you have two equal lines, and one looks longer than the other. I actually made that line longer than the other. And the AI looked at it, and I shared it with Claude, and I said, okay, which line is longer? It said, oh, both the lines are of the same length. This is actually the classic Miller-Lyer illusion. And I started giving it example after example of where I had a massive red circle and a tiny red circle. And it's like both these circles are of the same size. This is the classic Ebbinghaus illusion. It's hilarious if it weren't so sad, because now we have a school in Arizona which is completely AI run. They do not have any teachers. Right? It just got approved. It's a charter school that just got approved, and it's going to start, I think, this spring or in fall, whatever, right? And so the forces that are moving the technology are honestly out of control of educators, researchers, and so on. And those things determine the broader social, political discourse and landscape within which we function. And that I have become increasingly more and more sort of sensitive to, and sort of aware of, and hence somewhat pessimistic about, because those are forces that are not in our control. Now, what's the silver lining? I have taken your question seriously, as you can see. I'm jet lagged, so I'm waking up at 3 a.m. and I'm thinking this stuff, right? Just got back from India. So the silver lining, and I think this is where our show really, the episodes that work beautifully well are the ones, and I think Zhao sort of speaks about it as well, are these smaller local innovations that people are doing, because they are deeply contextually bound about what works and doesn't work. I mean, some of the examples, Lydia, that you have brought along of people who in a strip mall have set up a school, and, in other contexts of that nature, or those two young sisters who have started this, I don't remember the name of the school or the system that they have begun. I think that's where the silver lining is where individuals are finding that niche, that space where they're finding a need, and they're being incredibly creative and entrepreneurial within that space. So that's why I think the grand narratives, I have become increasingly suspicious of grand narratives, because the grand narratives that are coming out are Salman Khan's TED Talk that everybody's going to have a tutor or blah, 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 when this tool doesn't understand anything, has no connection with reality, whatever. It's sycophantic in nature. You can have a conversation with it, and you can say something wrong, and it will want to agree with you. I mean, it's weird. We're living in a very strange world. Yesterday, I was talking to one of our faculty members. He's creating these avatars using AI. And what he has to do to make it behave is say, I'm going to give you $1,000 in the bank. And every time you make this mistake, I will deduct $200. Your job is to never hit zero. And that improves the quality of the LLM output. What? And this is a technology that is supposed to be our savior? Give me a break. Right? So yes, I am pessimistic about the big thing, but then Steve Selig, who's designing this tool, he is working in an instructional design program. He's thinking very deeply about what his students need and so on, and working it out. So yes, innovation and silver lining is going to happen in these small spaces. I am deeply pessimistic about the long term and the larger context within which education happens. So that's my 2.5 cents. And I'm sorry I went on too long, maybe. So.
Well, I concur with you. It's the rebels out there that try and work around the systems, these learning management systems. We're trying to manage learners in a time in which we've moved away from behaviorism and instructor-centered learning towards more learner-centered and active learning, or constructivistic, or whatever you want to call it. Yet we have to still manage the learning process. So we're going back in time. At the same time, us rebels in the pedagogical space are moving ahead, and it's a conundrum. It's problematic. I will say that what hasn't changed, Punya, is you're still a very handsome guy, as we saw in the picture of you and Lee Schulman. And I can put it back up here in a second here. Let's see if we got this picture of you and Lee. There we go. Still a very handsome guy.
Thank you, sir. Lydia, I would love to hear your thoughts, particularly given that, we should have all done that, gone back and listened to what the heck we said at the beginning of the year so that we could be humbled by whatever we blabbered. But I would love to hear, as somebody who has been watching this show for a while and now is a part of the host group, what do you think has shifted in these 5 years? I mean, we started in the middle of the pandemic, and with a certain sort of an attitude and a hope or whatever, and we've gone on, and the world has shifted and we have changed, I'm sure, in ways. But would love to hear your perspective, partly as an outsider to this process, and now that you're part of the inside, like how has that transition been, and what are your thoughts on your questions?
Thank you, Punya, for throwing the question back to me. What really intrigued me in what you're saying, this kind of this tension between this ground narrative and the larger social and like technical environment versus this bottom-up, highly contextualized innovation that's happening in pockets of the world. And so I absolutely agree with you. I think that's kind of the conclusion, tentative conclusion I've came watching Silver Lining for Learning over the past 5 years, as well as having been a student, then a classroom teacher, then an educator, then a researcher. So kind of looking at this, how do I put it, education, the aspiration to transform education from different angles. And I've also come to this tentative conclusion that these highly contextualized human-driven innovations are what is actually changing education. It's not the grant narrative, it's not the smart board that the school board bought. It is not these like different pedagogies and PDs we are everyone have to implement in their classroom. It is that it starts from that human to human connection and identifying what really these learners needs within that environment, which I think every educator aspire to do. But there are a lot of hindrances actually with good intentions and get into the way. And so I think for next year, I would love to feature more of these bottom-up educators and education entrepreneurs and are doing these ground-up work. And I think they are very inspiring. They are really doing the hard work of changing education, not just from a narrative perspective, to think there is a quick fix to education, because there isn't. Having been an educator myself, a teacher in the classroom, sometimes I always wonder, like, what the education researchers are doing. Like, aren't they supposed to come in and change the classroom? Now, having been a researcher on the other side, I realize there is no easy fix, and we need all of us to work together and to really, I've also been wondering, like, what is education? Like, what is purpose education is supposed to serve? And Punya, you mentioned earlier, like, there is the management perspective, and there is like our hope for human flourishment, for really to help these individuals to come to realize their best potential. And there has to be a balance of both as well. And so there's just so much tensions and different factors in the classroom at play. So I think we need like all hands on the deck, and nobody's gonna come save and change education. That's just from like, I don't have as much experience as all of you. So when it comes to like these reflections over the past few years, I always feel a little humbled, but that's like what I've realized so far.
Lydia, we need to find another conference like the one you went to in DC that looked at non-traditional in informal learning and entrepreneurship and all that. What was the name of that conference again? It led to like 3 or 4 shows.
It's called VELA, VELA.
And what does it stand for?
I don't know. I don't think it stands for anything. I also wonder, what does VELA really mean? They just call themselves VELA. It's a conference. It's the name of the organization that fund these kind of non-traditional and conventional education. But I have no idea what VELA stands for.
So
Okay.
Vela, it's not relevant to this conversation at all, but is slang in India, like between young people, at least when I was young, is like if you're like a vagabond, you're at loose, you don't do anything. So what are you doing? I am Vela, means I am just hanging out.
Maybe that's it.
So I don't know if that's I don't think that is, but that's what it reminds me of, Vela. Yeah.
So I agree with the rest of you about the special role of Silver Lining for Learning. And when people talk to me and say, I really like Silver Lining for Learning, and I ask why, it is because it's about these very difficult contexts in which people who really care are able to make a big difference in the lives of their students and their community. And that's incredibly inspiring. And perversely, having talked about, how my optimism has gotten tempered by experience, I do feel that there's an interesting kind of optimism that comes out of the fact that 2025 looks like it's going to be an incredibly difficult year. Climate change, failure to reach the UN sustainability goals, autocrats taking over across the world, probably a great deal of economic uncertainty, lots of different regional wars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you believe in disruptive innovation, that's exactly the time that you can do a lot of what we celebrate on Silver Lining for Learning, because the systems that say no are under such pressure that they no longer can enforce. And then people do all sorts of interesting stuff around the edges, as they did at the start of the pandemic, because there was no one to stop them. And I think we might see another wave of innovation around the edges, disruptive innovation, in 2025. And if so, I hope we can find those projects and celebrate them in our episodes, because that will be a major contribution we can make.
So listeners, watchers, viewers, if you're attending one of those interesting conferences or come upon someone who's doing something we should feature on this show this coming year, let us know. Send us an email, give us a call. We'd be happy to include them or consider them for inclusion. So thank you very much. So I've got a question or something I'll share with all of you. I shared on email with you earlier or yesterday. A week ago, or maybe just a few days ago, I stumbled upon a couple of pictures of Chris teaching and doing a workshop at the University of Houston back in November of 2013. And I've got I can put them on because I've got them here. I think I got them. Here we go. So he's given a highly intellectual talk about digital teaching platforms, customizing classroom learning for each student. Let me see a few other shots of Chris there and interacting with folks at that event. And you can see they're very engaged in that topic with him, and he got a little t-shirt at the end with my colleagues, Sarah McNeil at the University of Houston, and Bernard Robin and Mimi Lee. And I'm not sure the last person there, but I've been there a number of times presenting myself. So I'm wondering, Chris, and all of us, we'll go back to the first slide up here. There, what customizing learning for each student would be like a decade after Chris's talk, or actually 12 years later. We're 11 or 12 years later. That was in November of 2013. So first of all, Chris, can you tell us a little bit about that event and about that talk and why you designed that talk? What was it about and how things have changed since then in your eyes, given this new age of AI that we're in the midst of? And then the three of us, can reflect on what you have to say.
Well, to be honest, I don't remember the specific event because I do a lot of talks, and at that time I was doing a lot of talks that would have looked similar, because in 2012, John Richards and I published a co-edited book that was about this concept of digital teaching platforms. It essentially was, prior to the term learning engineering, it was a learning engineering book, because it was about how you create an infrastructure that enables the kinds of data flows, the kinds of analyses, the kinds of interpretation and feedback that can allow personalization in a classroom. And one of the examples we used was a system at that time that had developed in Israel called Time to Know, that was like an early example of a digital teaching platform. Now, these were not behaviorists. So this is not saying it was an early learning management system, because it wasn't a learning suppression system in the way that a lot of the behaviorists are learning suppression systems. But one of the things that was interesting to me about that book, I don't know if you remember in 2018 when the National Academy brought out How People Learned version 2. And I'm sure, like many other people, I was curious as to whether or not I was cited in the book. And so I did a little search, and I was cited, but I was cited for digital teaching platforms, along with John Richards. And a lot of the other stuff that I had written that was more learning sciences oriented, nowhere to be found. So then I did some other searches. People like Roy P. weren't cited at all, right? A lot of the kind of heroes of learning science weren't cited at all. Now, one can feel however you like about interpreting that, but I think that it was really a statement about the fact that the benefits of science are only realized when you have engineering to transfer them. And that's some of what message that committee was trying to convey in what it came up with. So I like the talk, and I wouldn't probably change anything in it other than to update it. Because now, for example, with natural language processing, we can collect a different kind of data, we can analyze a different kind of data. That changes a lot of things. With immersive learning, we can evoke a much richer set of behaviors than was possible to evoke at that time. And that opens up a whole lot of things. Now, are we taking advantage of those? No, not at scale, but at least, you know, the prospect is there.
So I wonder if Punya or Lydia, you want to talk about how you think things have become more customized, personalized since 2013 for students in our digital learning formats. And by the way, I looked myself up in Wikipedia several times, and the only place I ever show up is in instructional design. And I'm not an instructional designer, okay? I got totally bored to tears taking instructional design courses. So, but they took one model that I created that was used by instructional designers and said, oh, he's an expert in instructional design. I cannot teach instructional design as much as that my department tries to get me to teach it. Number one, I don't know the stuff well enough. And number two, I'd be bored to tears teaching it. I'm sorry if anyone from my department is listening to this episode right now. I love instructional design. No, so yes, Chris, I hear what you're saying. We actually changed the entire course on learning theories as a result of the new volume. And actually, as a result of that new volume, because they changed that course, they no longer let me teach that course on learning theories that I've been teaching for over 2 to 3 decades. So that course did change. That book did change my life too. But it's nonetheless, people should get that book because it's free and it will teach you a lot about how people learn. Anyways, Punya, Lydia, do you want to comment on what Chris had to say there?
Go ahead. I can jump in after.
Sure. Actually, I read that book, Chris, Digital Teaching Platform, before I applied for doctoral program, and I find the book really inspiring. And I really I found the idea of personalization very interesting. But now, since now I've completed my doctoral program and I'm in a postdoc now, I think, Chris, the idea of personalization in your book and how personalization has been really loosely interpreted by the general, I don't know, by the public or by industry players is quite different. I think personalization often is interpreted as whatever mechanism that serve the individual. Of course, that's part of it, but it's much more than that. We can personalize in a way that also serve the group and the larger collective. We can personalize people's learning path when they learn with each other. We can make the collaborative process more efficient, more effective, and conducive for people. And we can track how people engage in these collaborative process, and that's also personalization. But I think an example of the narrow interpretation of personalization is this very pervasive tutoring system that's AI powered these days. That is way personalized learning means to give you the exact contents you need in that moment, or have a tutor that's completely adapted to you. I think that's a really narrow interpretation of personalization, and I think we need to expand that a little bit more.
So I can build right out of that, Lydia. Thank you for that, because I think the how we define personalization, I think, is a very critical piece of the puzzle in some ways, right? And you're absolutely right that the way personalization that we've been thinking of, or as is talked about by the Salman Khans of the world, or a lot of the sort of the AI tutoring, is you need to be able to balance equations, right? And here are the pathways that you can do, and we can guide you through the pathways. But that's a weird kind of personalization, because the kid doesn't give a shit about why he has to balance equations. I mean, we never asked that question, and that's, pardon my language. But the question really is personalization is I want to learn X, and how can this system, and here's the sad thing, I think that these new AI technologies actually allow for that. The internet allows for that. The internet allows for you to go and explore and play with ideas but again, these are learners. They haven't developed a judgment about what is right and wrong, and they haven't developed that expertise about distinguishing between a YouTube video, which is a complete fraud, and a YouTube video which is genuinely scientific in nature. I mean, I have some cousins of mine, incredibly smart young man, but he has not developed the judgment to determine what is a YouTube video, which is this aeroplane vanished and it reappeared 50 years later. Nobody understands why. To him, that's as true as a video by Brian Greene about the cosmos. So he can spout as eloquently about both of them. That's because he has not developed those filters and so on, right? And I think that's where true personalization should be. But that's not how we were talking about it. We are talking about it. We are taking the adaptive testing, like the SATs and GREs, where you are at this point and we'll give you one question slightly difficult. Oh, you got that wrong. We will drop it down a notch. That's what we have taken to be personalization, just flipped it around as a tutor, right? So that's one. The second piece.
Wait a minute, Punya, before you go any further, you're taking the view, the Bill Gates view of personalized learning, that is us doing something, creating something, adaptive testing, adaptive learning kinds of things, as opposed to the Papert version of
Yes.
the Seymour Papert version of kids creating a visual. The AI lets you create a podcast show like this one, video creation, visual creation, create a story, helping you write a research report that's your research report, concept maps, whatever it is, do a presentation. Sure. These are empowering tools. So,
and they can be deeply, disciplinary connected. I mean, I think one of the big things is we have to recognize that Howard Gardner, I think, sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I think also trying to make an important point, said one of the greatest inventions that humans have come up with is the idea of the discipline, that we can use a lens of physics to look at the world in terms of forces and, so on and so forth. And it's a very productive way of looking at the world, as is sociology, as is history, as is music. These are lenses for looking and interpreting the world. And so I think schooling, one of the most important things schooling does is introduce us to these disciplines, right? But if you look at how Papert viewed it, and thank you for giving that example, because if you read Mindstorms, if you read those, those are deeply disciplinary ideas he's engaging with, that the students are engaging with, but not in that lockstep way that I think a lot of this adaptive learning kind of pieces talk about. So thank you for that. That's perfect. There's another thing that I want to just mention, and we don't have to get into it in depth, but I think there is this dual pressure that I'm seeing with EdTech that's happening now. So there is, at one end, you have Jonathan Haidt and his book on the anxious generation and so on. So you have this huge movement to remove cell phones and technology from classrooms, right? And we can go into what that means and why and what's going on and so on and so forth. And I have my sort of take on it, and that's fine. And at the same time, we have this other push, which is, we need to get this AI into our things, which is going to personalize learning and so on. And a large part of those AI systems are now embedded in these very tools that we are trying to ban. Right? And so then you start having these AI tools embedded in devices, which are going to be kept just in schools and just in this, so that you can interact with them for the 2 hours or 3 hours that you need to, which to me again seems weird, because this is part of the ecosystem within which we live. And what are schools for if not to prepare you to succeed and thrive as citizens in this ecosystem that we live in, right? So I think there's this interesting tension that I see building, technology, anti-technology, sometimes the same people saying things from both sides of their mouth, maybe, I think that's an interesting piece as well, which sort of connects to the personalization, because by denying students this to have with you, you are denying them some level of agency. You are denying them their agency in controlling and determining how they would interact with the world, how they will learn, how they will engage with each other and the world, right? And so in some ways, the personalization, the adaptive personalization, and the denying of these tools are part of the same movement to deny agency to students, which is something like Papert or someone would very strongly be against, right? I'm not sure where I'm going with this, as much as like these were thoughts that sort of I've been thinking about and sort of came through in this moment. Would love to hear your responses.
I have a quick thought. Having been a teacher, I feel the tension between like in the cell phone, because I know when kids have these cell phones, it's distractive for them because they are looking at Instagrams, they're looking at, I don't know what apps they are on these days. But on the other hand, if we don't let them use them, they will never develop the self-discipline, the self-regulation, the judgment, like what to look at, what not to look at, because there's just a whole bunch of stuff going on in the wild world. So I definitely feel a little bit often torn, like cell phone or no cell phone. And like going back to an earlier reflection, I was talking about like educator, we always play this catch-up game with technology. It's often, and then so like so as a result, I feel like with the education, whatever, we come up with these like apps for education. So in a very controlled environment, Punya, as you mentioned, like you use this for the every 2 hours, and I can see everything you do in there as a teacher. But those is not very authentic in that way. The kids don't find that as engaging as they go talk to their friends on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. So how can we marry like the both world together, make sure it is authentic in their learning and what they're doing? Because learning, they're also doing these authentic things. They're doing real things in it's not just oh, you learn something is like less authentic, and we want to make that really personal and meaningful to them. But how can we marry this best world together? That's when I was thinking, how can educators or people who have a passion for education and learning or human flourishment design these technology that's actually good for humans? Because we know Instagram, all of these texts, they are not, I'm mentioning Instagram a lot. I have nothing against Instagram, but we know a lot of these social media apps or whatever's being developed, they are built for addiction, for you to scroll more and more, to spend more and more time. They're not built for productive engagement. They are not built for you to become a better human. And so that's one way I was thinking, how can we stop playing this catch-up game with these big tech firms? And how can we actually, this big tech firm or whatever that's going to happen, it will actually build good technology for people. And then so with teacher, we can stop being so torn between, should I let my kids go on social media or should I take their cell phone away? Because we know whatever they engage in, it will be good for them. That's a bit ideal, but that's a hope I have.
Well, it does come down to the big tech companies in many ways, and the big tech companies have excellent PR groups that emphasize the contributions that those companies make to education, and some of the contributions are genuine. But on balance, the minute that something would cut into their bottom line, you see where the real priorities are. And as you say, Lydia, it's essentially more and more usage, more and more data, which drives their financial model, more and more usage, which drives their what they can charge, etc. And I did an invited talk for a big tech company. I'm deliberately not going to use the name. And I deliberately pushed some buttons. You talked about algorithmic enhancement of usage, and I said what we need is algorithmic suppression, and gave them some examples. And when I first interacted with them, they said, "Oh, we're setting up this special group, and we'll get back in touch with you about being a part of it, and it's going to work to help us do better in education." I'm still waiting for that call. And I'm not surprised, right? I'm not surprised, because they only want to hear people that are going to praise them for the mixed bag that they're providing in education, as opposed to saying, here are ways that it could be better. And you can imagine the name of any big tech company for the one that I know about, and it would be the truth for all of them. So social media are out of control, and it isn't just kids that are being lured into lots of dysfunctional behaviors that are making our society a worse and worse place to be. But no one is willing to bell the cap in terms of taking on the big tech companies in a way that would really make a difference. I'm sure that somebody could write a program that in a school environment would not allow you to use a whole bunch of apps. I'm sure that there are programs like that in national security settings. But
Yeah.
it'll never happen. It'll never happen because the
So,
companies won't let it happen.
so I wrote this blog post that, Kurt had put up there about Lee Schulman, and then I heard about this new AI school that Arizona just approved, charter school that they approved. No teachers. They would have 2 hours with AI, deeply personalized learning, which would give them feedback. And you have brand ambassadors who will guide you. I mean, it's from an educator point of view, it's almost like a dystopian nightmare. So I wrote this post about it. And Chris, you'll sort of, the reason I bring it up because it sort of aligns with what you're saying, which I quoted this guy called Chamath Palihapitiya. And he is a former VP, vice president of Facebook of Growth. And he was asked, and he said of whether his children are allowed to use these tools, and his exact quote, and I pardon the use of the language again, which is, his children were not allowed to use that shit. That's the person who is responsible for promoting this globally. All right. So there is this fundamental hypocrisy built in here. And so one of my friends, Anurag Bihar, he's a very thoughtful, reflective educator, works for the Azim Premji Foundation University in India. And one of his things was, anytime somebody comes up with an educational innovation, ask them the question, will you send your children to that school? And the question I ask of the people who are setting up this charter school, will they send their children to this school? And I'm very honest with you, the chances are they will not. And so why do we come up with solutions for other children's problems that we would not accept for our own? I think is a fundamental question that we should ask for everybody, right? Would Bill Gates say my kid is going to learn only using Khan Academy? That's a question I think worth asking, right? That's, at the end of the day, when you make a decision for your child, what works. Sending them to a space where they're respected, sending them to a space where they're allowed to play and learn and grow and interact and engage with each other on a diversity of topics and ways is what you want your children to have for the most part. Right? We can differ on details. And I think that's where I think the struggle really is for me, is that why do we, when I speak of we, I think collectively as a species, are willing to accept things for other people's children that we would not accept for ourselves, for our own kids. And that to me is like foundational to whatever it is that we do. Like, would I send my kid to that school? And the short answer is no, I would not. And then I should not promote. Simple.
Well said. Well, extremely well said, Punya, Chris, Lydia. We've got 5 minutes before I introduce the next show. I did send a question yesterday. If any of you want to answer it, it relates to, what are a couple of items on your in basket that you're wanting to watch or read or listen to in the coming weeks, months, year, or what did you listen to, watch, or read in the prior year that you want to bring up today to recommend to other people? So is there anything from the past year that you encountered that you want to recommend others watch, listen, or read, or whatever experience, or something that you're looking to do in the coming weeks or months? And I'll start off, so they're all thinking. I've got a couple of articles in front of me here. One's called Empowering Education Leaders, a Toolkit for Safe, Ethical, and Equitable AI Integration, from the Office of Educational Technology. And now it's a lot thicker than this. This is only the first 10 or 20 pages of a long report, but I'm going to assign it to my students in my Emerging Technologies or Emerging Learning Technologies class, of which I'm teaching 2 sections in the spring. I'm going to teach a face-to-face class for the first time in 5 years. So this will be great. So I'm actually going to read it along with another report from National Academies, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Work, 2024. And I'm sure Chris has seen this one, since this is an area he's been reading, writing, thinking about for almost his entire career, if not his entire career. So those are a couple of things on my list. There's going to be many, many, many more. I'm also listening to the biography 54 Hour of Harry Truman right now. I highly recommend to anyone who wants to listen to a book or read a book. But that's not related to our show. Chris, Punya, Lydia?
So in Silver Lining for Learning in the fall, we did 4 shows on 4 of the 5 national AI institutes related to education. And those were really just appetizers. They were overviews of work that's going on at each of those 4. We'll have another one on the institute that I'm part of in February to complete the set. I would urge people to regularly go to those websites to look at the kinds of things that are coming out of those groups. They're done by people who understand AI, so they're not selling, magic beans. They're not done by a group that's trying to turn itself into a corporation. So it isn't all about the financial model. And between them, I think there's some really interesting work going on. But as always, it's hard to get something over the transom and into the real world from something that's happening in a laboratory setting or an institute setting. And so being able to be the translator, the person that bridges, the person that pulls it out and makes use of it in the real world, I think is an important role.
Before Lydia and Punya jump in there, the word translation is appearing more and more in job announcements, and it is a critical skill today. So people listening to this episode and thinking about the skills that they need, translation skills, taking the research out there and turning into ideas, guidelines, and caveats for implementation in the real world is a way in which you can get a job. Punya, Chris, or Lydia.
So I can jump in very briefly. I think I have decided that there is a superpower to being an academic. It struck me sometime last year when I was in some panels and things that way. Because all the people on the panel, they were like from US Department of Ed, or they were doing professional development for teachers and so on. So everybody had something to sell. And I realized that it's so awesome being an academic because I have nothing to sell. And I can be as curmudgeonly as I want, which is I'm increasingly becoming that as I get older, which is great because I can be very excited about the technology. I love like some of the AI stuff. I play with it and work with it all the time, and it helps me think and all kinds of stuff. But at the same time, I can also be very cranky about what I see is happening in the world at large. And that's a huge privilege, I think, given to us as academics. And I think part of my sort of mini New Year's resolution this year is I'm going to really lean into that because not everybody has that freedom, and that's a wonderful freedom to have, to be able to see both sides and be able to sort of say, yeah, it's complicated. I think if nothing else, sometimes academics are sort of maligned for always being like, on the other hand. I think that I've come to realize that actually is a superpower to be able to say that because most people don't have the freedom to do so. And I think that's something I feel like I'm really leaning into as I go forward.
Something I'm looking forward to reading. Going back to the Vela conference we mentioned earlier that featured a lot of bottom-up educators and education entrepreneurs. They recommend this book called The Beautiful Tree, a personal journey into how the world's poorest people are educating themselves. So it was written by James Tolley. And so it's a book that is about these ground up communities that are really deprived socioeconomically, but they still find ways and to educate their children. I'm really excited about this book, and I think it will be very inspiring.
So I think I need to introduce the next show, episode 218 of Silver Lining for Learning, next Saturday at 11 a.m. because we have people coming from different parts of the world. We're going to talk to people from Crystal House International. For over 25 years, Crystal House has been dedicated to empowering children from underserved communities to realize their potential and transform their futures. We've done this by providing the comprehensive support system that they need to thrive in school and beyond. They use a holistic model for kids, young kids to age 18. This in-depth whole child approach integrates rigorous academic learning with nutrition and healthcare, life skills, social support, college and career guidance. It's a deep commitment to help students demonstrate that they have limitless potential. They are in India, Jamaica, Mexico, South America, and Indianapolis. And so that's how I got a hold of the folks there, because they're connected to IU and have a partnership with Indiana University. So they'll be joining us next week at 11 o'clock. We'll see you then. Enjoy the coming week.